Good morning, ladies. Today we are moving into chapter 7 of the Sermon on the Mount. So we just have, including today, 4 more lessons. And it has been just a wonderful opportunity for me personally to really dig in to see what Jesus was saying. So much of the time we know certain segments of the Sermon on the Mount because we've maybe even memorized them, like the Lord's Prayer, but we don't really dig in and get to the heart of the matter or the meat of the matter. And it reminds me that there are people all over the world today, especially in America, who know a little bit about 1 or 2 verses in the Bible, but don't really know and even maybe use them periodically. And there are things that aren't even in the Bible that people claim are in the Bible. People say God helps those who help themselves, or God will never give you more than you can handle, and they just think they know what they're talking about, but then it's not even in the Bible. Or they'll say something about for God so loved the world, thinking that everybody's going to heaven. And so there's a temptation to claim that you know a particular verse in the Bible, but then in fact you misquote it or misuse it. And we're going to be seeing one today that is definitely in that category. I'll tell you in a minute. The last few lessons we've covered in chapter 6 had more to do with our personal, individual walk with Jesus. Things like prayer, giving, fasting, where Jesus challenged our motives and our heart attitude about these practices that we are all called to do. Then we saw that Jesus challenged us individually about what our hearts treasured most, worldly things or Jesus. He talked about the eyes of our hearts and the things we look at with our eyes. He told us to fight to believe God in our daily living, to refuse worry and anxiety, but instead to trust Him with every little and big thing. He challenged us to choose between Him and the gods of the world. So now we're going to go from the inner heart to see some examples of how we're challenged in interpersonal relationships with others, whether the person is a Christian or not. So Jesus is going to tell me to stop worrying again, but this time to stop worrying about what other people are doing. Now you may remember that Jesus had told us earlier in Matthew 5:20 that unless your righteousness was greater than that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you couldn't be saved. Well, unfortunately, I think there's some people that think the way to make oneself more righteous is to simply become more judgmental of others. Jesus was here he was rebuking that kind of thinking in this lesson today, and he would say that self-righteous people are probably judgmental people. So let's look at the passage. It's very familiar to all of you. Matthew 7, 1 through 5. Judge not, that you will not be judged. For with the same judgment that you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Now, here you've already caught it. Among those who know nothing about the Bible, this is the verse that seems to be the most popular. Most of the time when you hear people simply say, judge not, lest you be judged, what they really mean is, you can't judge me. Yet, most of the people who quote this verse don't even close to don't even come close to understanding what Jesus said. They seem to think, or maybe hope, that Jesus commanded a universal acceptance of any lifestyle or teaching. But in fact, Jesus is placing a huge neon red blinking sign over us that tells us, caution, judge this person at your own risk. It is meant to give us very serious pause or hesitation and examine our own selves before saying anything about another person. You know, my biggest problem is not how others judge me, but how I judge others. And also notice the word brothers in verse 3. What is Jesus telling you and me about who we tend to judge? Well, unfortunately, he's saying that we church ladies have a habit of making unfair judgments of each other. You know, my fallen nature is profoundly selfish and proud, and often hypocritical, judging myself indulgently, yet others severely. We're like the Pharisees that Jesus spoke of, who were quick to strain gnats and swallow camels. You blind guides, straining out a gnat to swallow a camel. I hope you hear the humor in what Jesus said right there, because it's very close to the thing that he's saying about the speck and the log, where he's talking to a lot of hypocritical Pharisees, telling them that they are straining, actually literally they would strain their wine to make sure there were no little tiny little impurities in it, yet they swallow a camel. A camel would have been to them this is quite a statement for Jesus to talk about them being willing to accept a camel. A camel, number one, was unclean according to Jewish law, and it was the largest, relative to a gnat, it was the largest land animal that was in the area of Israel. And so he was making a joke to make a point about how they fret over the tiniest little things, yet they miss the larger, bigger issues of the heart. And so there again, it's a similar thing to the relative difference between a speck and a speck and a log. You know, when it comes to judging others, we're quick to take tweezers to another person's eye, while all along we ourselves need a forklift for our own eye. And we all know this truth. We're irritated to death by the bad habits and actions of people with the very same bad habits and actions that we ourselves have. I recently complained to a very dear friend about someone who makes everything about herself. I see this person only a few times a year, maybe twice a year, at Costco or somewhere, and I'm suddenly getting 6 months of stories about her grandkids. They're the greatest things since sliced bread. And as in telling that to my friend, she simply nodded and had this little annoying grin on her face. I got the message immediately. I do the same thing. And so it's so much like us to spot it. And then I heard the saying yesterday, if you spot it, you got it. In other words, we judge the very things we're guilty of doing ourselves. And so we go on further in the sermon, just a little later in this same chapter, Jesus said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits." Now, he's talking here about actually observing these. What he's going to be talking about are the false teachers. But he says, observe their behavior. Is there fruit in their life that confirms that they truly are believers? So he's telling us, observe, analyze, judge. Okay, so he's giving us instructions to actually judge another person by the fruit that's in their life. And so some sort of assessment or judgment is necessary in order for us to recognize the false teachers. The Christian is called to show unconditional love, but the Christian is not called to give unconditional approval. We really can love people who still do things that we should not be approving of. Okay, so the heart, again and again and again, Jesus talks to us about our heart. Not just what happens on the outside, but what happens on the inside. How are we loving a person, even if we are not approving of their behavior? So while these words of Jesus do not prohibit examining the lives of others, it certainly prohibits doing it in the wrong spirit, and the spirit where it's often done, where it's to do gotcha. We have these gotchas. We caught that person doing something wrong, and that is such a self-righteous attitude. An example of this unjust judgment was the disciples' condemnation of this woman who came to anoint the feet of Jesus with oil. And what Jesus said to them, because they were condemning her with doing something so wasteful, that could have been sold for a large amount of money and that money given to the poor. But Jesus said, no, hang on, no way. He says, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So they thought she was wasting something. But Jesus said she had just done a good work that would always be remembered. They had a rash, harsh, and unjust judgment. So back in Matthew 7, verse 2, he says, "For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged." So again, Jesus doesn't prohibit the judgment of others with what judgment you use. So he's acknowledging that we will be called on to judge. He's only requiring that our judgment be completely fair and that we only judge others by a standard we would also like to be judged by. Now that's a strong statement. When our judgment in regard to others is wrong, it's often not because we judge according to a standard, but because we are hypocritical in the application of that standard. We ignore the standard in our own life, yet we judge it in someone else's. It's very, very common to do this, to judge others by one standard and ourselves by another standard, being far more generous to ourselves than we are to someone else. Our hypocrisy in these matters is always more evident to others than it is to ourselves. We may find a way to ignore the plank in our own eye, but others notice it right away. A good example of this kind of hypocrisy was David's reaction to Nathan's story about a man who unjustly stole and killed another man's lamb. David quickly condemned that man. He was ready to put him in jail or even have him executed. But he was blind to his own sin, which was much, much greater in the taking of another man's wife. And Nathan called him out on it. He said, "You are that man." So I want us to look at a couple of passages by Paul where in some places he says don't judge other Christians, and in other places he says judge other Christians. Okay, so is Paul being double tonguing or contradicting himself? Well, no, it's two different scenarios. In 1 Corinthians 4, verse 5, he says, "Therefore do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God." So he's talking about, in the meantime, before Jesus returns and before judgment comes on the earth, refrain from judgment. These ulterior motives of the heart are not readily available right now. So just hold off on judging. And at the right time, when Jesus returns, every person will receive the reward or the condemnation or whatever is called for. But then in 1 Corinthians 5:12, just a chapter later, Paul says, "For what have I to do with judging outsiders?" In other words, non-Christians. "Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge?" And that was a rhetorical question, but the answer is yes. As we said earlier, judge the false teachers by their fruit. Now here he's saying, fellow Christians, there is a standard by which we are to live, and when Christians don't live according to that standard, Paul is saying that we are to call them out on it. And so, we're going to get back to that in just a minute, but I want to mention one other problem with rushing to judgment. You know, we live under a legal system in the United States, which is developed from the old Mosaic law, where a person is accused, or when a person is accused of a legal transgression, but the evidence against that person is inconclusive. In our system, it demands that we presume their innocence until there's sufficient evidence to demonstrate guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that demonstration is typically not quickly or easily gathered. So when Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13:7, "Love believes all things," he was talking about this kind of charitable judgment of innocent until proven guilty. We're called to believe the best about each other until sufficient evidence confirms beyond a reasonable doubt that a transgression has occurred. So are we aiming for restoration or condemnation? When evidence does confirm that a transgression has occurred, a second way we take great care is in how we judge is to aim for restoration. Paul says this again in 2 Corinthians 13:11. "Finally, brothers, rejoice. Aim for restoration. Comfort one another. Agree with one another. Live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you." So, if we're personally involved in such a situation, our goal is confronting someone caught in sin, or if necessary, maybe even initiating a process of church discipline. And that's the purpose, is to gain back our brother or sister. Jesus said in Matthew 18:15, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother." Our goal is not punitive, but redemptive. We must vigilantly remain kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave us. So, and then there's one more passage Well, there's probably more than one more, but the one that I'm remembering off the cuff here is Galatians 6:1, where it says, if any one of you, in other words, in your church, in your fellowship, in your small group, in your Bible study group, if any one of you falls into sin, let those of you who are spiritual bring him back. Okay, help him with the correction. Help him be restored. And so that is the kind of situation we're called to do, because everyone is going to sin, and everyone needs someone to love them enough to bring them back to full restoration. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul deals with a situation where gross sin had taken place. A man in the church was having sex with his stepmother. It was causing such a stir, and so Paul wrote a letter instructing the elders how to deal with this man. And he says, even if that guilty person is unrepentant, then fellowship must be severed. And the purpose, though, even if that person is excommunicated, it remains redemptive for the offender. Let me read to you in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6, where he says, and for the church, you are to deliver this man over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. All right, do you understand what's going on here? Excommunication because of a repetitive sin that he's unwilling to quit. And so the church is to excommunicate him, put him out of the church, which is what he's saying here, deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Take him out of the protection of the Holy Spirit, which is in the church, and put him outside of the church, vulnerable to Satan, where he would possibly even be killed. But again, redemption is found then for his soul. He says, so that his soul, or that his spirit, might be saved in the day of the Lord. Okay, the day of the Lord is when he returns, that this man's soul would be saved. And then he goes on in verse 6 and says, your boasting is not good. How were they boasting? It says earlier in the chapter that they were arrogant about this sin. And that arrogance was causing great concern to Paul, that they weren't holding fast to a biblical standard in their church fellowship. They were letting people just do anything, live any lifestyle they wanted. And I'm afraid that is happening in our churches today. And so he says in verse 6, don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? So the church is the whole lump that needs to be protected from this sinful lifestyle that could infiltrate the entire church and cause a lot of heartache and a lot of problems. So let's wrap this up. If we're not personally involved in a particular issue where someone has sinned, or maybe we're distant observers, we can still aim for that person's restoration by, if possible, just not saying anything. A wise rule of thumb is the greater our distance, the greater our ignorance. An ignorant commentary about a person or situation is never helpful, and it's usually nothing more than gossip or slander, which Jesus calls evil. So if we're on the outside periphery of a situation, Jesus is telling us, and Paul is telling us over and over again, just stay out of it, because if you're not a witness to it or have eyewitness or firsthand knowledge of the person's sinful lifestyle, then don't gossip about it. Just stay out of it. Our goal in confronting a Christian caught in sin is to gain back our brother or sister. So by not saying anything, we're not disturbing the potential for restoration for this person. We must remember how faulty our perceptions are and how our biases distort our judgment. We often think we understand what's going on when in reality we do not. From a distance, love covers a multitude of sins. Peter says this in 1 Peter 4:8. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. And what that looks like is to not repeat the matter. Proverbs 17:9 says, whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends. You know, you and I are not needed in every situation. And in fact, our gossiping about something that someone is doing really does interfere with the process. And so we need to stay out of it. There are definitely times when we are called on to become involved, but it's only that we do this kind of reluctantly, that we are dragged into a situation because we were maybe an eyewitness to it or have first-hand knowledge, not third or fourth-hand knowledge. And the final thing I want to say here is the extent to which we are hard on others reveals the extent to which we do not understand the grace that God has already extended to me. Let me say that positively now. That was negatively. The extent to which I am patient, loving, and gracious to others reveals the extent to which I understand the patience, love, and grace the Father has extended to me. And to always remember, there but for the grace of God go I. Thanks, ladies, for listening. We will talk again next week.